Hi everybody, my name's Hannah Mackay-Tate and I'm a tour guide here in Edinburgh. Since it's Pride Month, I wanted us to go and have a look at some of the city's LGBTQ history. Now, obviously there have always been LGBTQ people in Edinburgh and everywhere else, but prejudice over the years has often meant that their stories went unrecorded. In Scotland, what was referred to under the law as homosexual acts between men were illegal until 1981. Now, that was just 7 years before I was born, and it means that my parents were at university with people who could have been arrested for being gay. Thankfully, Scotland has come a long way since then, and we'll learn a bit later about some of the people who helped to make that happen. But first, let's take a wander around the city and discover some of the LGBTQ history stories that have survived over the years. James Stewart was born in 1566 to Mary Queen of Scots in Edinburgh Castle, behind me here. He was James VI of Scotland from when he was just 1 year old, and in 1601, when Elizabeth I of England died without an heir, he also became King James I of England. He was the first monarch to hold both of those thrones together. Although he was a staunchly Protestant king, and he's known for religious acts like commissioning the King James Bible and for his vicious countrywide witch hunts, which resulted in many executions taking place on the very ground where I'm standing, even in his own lifetime, people knew about his romantic relationships with men. He did marry a woman, Anna of Denmark, and they had children together, although it's worth noting that that would have been an obligation for any king who had to produce an heir. And there is evidence that he had an affair with another woman in the 1590s. But he's most famous perhaps for his relationships with men, with his male favourites. And there's evidence of at least 3 of those that survives in the historical record. The most famous was a guy called George Villiers, whom James later promoted to be the first Duke of Buckingham. This recently rediscovered Rubens portrait of Villiers shows him as an elegant man with a twinkle in his eye, so you can see why James might have been interested. There are letters that survive between James and George that tell us something about the nature of their relationship. In 1623, James wrote to George, "I desire to live only in this world for your sake, and that I had rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you. And may so God bless you, my sweet child and wife, and grant that ye may ever be a comfort to your dear dad and husband." George's own letters to James include lines like this: "I naturally so love your person and adore all your other parts, which are more than ever one man had." Now, naturally, lots of historians over the years have been keen to suggest that James and George and his other male favourites were just very good friends, for reasons that I'm sure have absolutely nothing to do with structural homophobia. Let's jump forward a couple of centuries and we'll go and learn about a pioneering Irish doctor. Dr. James Barry grew up in Cork in Ireland, and he came to Edinburgh to study medicine in 1809. Now, the medical school has moved since then, but back then this building behind me, Old Surgeons' Hall, was one of the places where medical teaching took place. So Dr. Barry probably walked through this door that you can see here over 200 years ago. When he graduated with his medical degree in 1812, he joined up to the British Army as a surgeon. That was a job that took him all over the world, which at that time, a lot of which was part of the British Empire. He was an obstetric pioneer, and when he was stationed in South Africa in the 1820s, he performed one of the world's first recorded caesarean sections where both mother and baby survived. He was also known as a social campaigner who pushed for improvements to sanitation and living conditions, both for soldiers and civilians, wherever he was stationed. And sometimes he did this so vociferously that he was arrested and disciplined by the army for his lack of tact. He was known as quite a bad-tempered and opinionated man, but his colleagues all also spoke of what a skilled doctor he was and how professional he was with his patients. He travelled all over the world with his job and conducted research into things like controlling cholera epidemics as well, so his work was hugely influential and important. By any standards, he had a distinguished medical and military career, and history would have remembered him. But it's not until Dr. Barry died that extra information about him came to light. He'd retired from the army in 1859, and he settled down in London, where he sadly died just 6 years later. He had always left instructions that when he died, his body should be wrapped in the bedsheets and buried. No autopsy, no preparing the body for his funeral. For whatever reason, this instruction was ignored after Dr. Barry's death, and it came to be known that he had been assigned female at birth. Now, this information scandalised the British Army, probably in part because someone they now viewed as a woman had managed to have such a distinguished medical and military career at a time when that was closed off to women in the UK. So they ordered the records about Dr. Barry to be sealed for 100 years, meaning that his story didn't really start to come to light until the 20th century as people investigated it more. Now, we will never know for sure how Dr. Barry himself identified, because there is nothing left in his own words to tell us. Out of respect for the fact that he went by James for his whole adult life, I've chosen to use the male pronouns that he was known by while he was alive, but we'll never be 100% sure what his real internal story was. What it does show us, though, is that even back in the early 1800s, the concept of gender wasn't necessarily something that was set in stone. But Dr. Barry wasn't the only pioneering doctor at Edinburgh University, so let's head off and learn about another 19th century medical pioneer. While we're on our way to meet our next medical pioneer, I just wanted to stop quickly at this building, which is just around the corner from Old Surgeons' Hall. This is now a tapestry studio called Dovecot, but back in the day it was a public baths, a swimming pool and a place that people could go and wash before bathrooms were widely available in people's houses. It was also, back in the 1920s and 1930s, a popular gay cruising spot for gay men to meet each other. That might not have been its publicly stated function, but that is one of the things it was known for. And we know that because the police conducted raids here in order to arrest gay men who had come to meet people in these public baths. I just wanted to stop and point this out because I think it's a great example of the fact that LGBTQ history is just as much woven into the fabric of our streets and our buildings as any other aspect of history. It's just sometimes a little bit harder to uncover. In 1869, an English woman called Sophia Jex-Blake applied to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh. Now, at that time, there were no women admitted to any British universities, and particularly not to study something as unladylike as medicine. The university told Sophia that they couldn't make arrangements in the interest of one lady. But she wasn't going to be deterred, so she put adverts in the papers looking for other women who wanted to apply to do the medical degree as well, figuring that if there were enough of them, the university couldn't make that same excuse. Eventually, these 7 women were allowed to matriculate, and they came to be known as the Edinburgh Seven. However, throughout their academic careers, they experienced huge prejudice and discrimination, both from their peers and from lecturers. In 1870, they turned up to sit an anatomy exam at Surgeons' Hall on Nicholson Street, and they were met by an angry mob who slammed the gates in their face and pelted them with rubbish. Eventually, a sympathetic male student opened the gates back up for them again, and they were allowed in to sit their exam. Now, part of the reason for this kind of animosity towards them might have been that almost all of the women were outperforming all of the men on the course academically. But in 1873, the university denied them the right to graduate, and they actually said that they should never have been admitted to the course in the first place. Eventually, they did give them posthumous medical degrees, but that didn't happen until 2019. That's just last year. And actually, most of these women went on to get their MD in their own lifetime in the 1870s from universities in continental Europe that were offering these degrees to women already. In 1878, now a qualified doctor, Dr. Jex-Blake returned to Edinburgh and set up practice as the city's first female physician. She also, a few years later, set up a medical school for women, and that's where she met Margaret Todd, who she would have a relationship with for the rest of her life. Margaret also went on to become a doctor and an author, and the two women lived together for most of a 25-year period, including here in this building behind me. This came to be the Bruntsfield Hospital, but it was where Dr. Jex-Blake had her practice and lived with Margaret for 16 years. Eventually, in 1899, they retired down to Sussex together, where they lived out the rest of their days. Sophia died in 1912, and Margaret wrote a biography of her, but we only really have their public words to describe their relationship. Sophia had left instructions that after her death, her diaries and all of her papers should be burned by Margaret. Now, that in itself suggests there was something that she didn't want people to know about her life. Nowadays, it's mostly assumed that these two women were partners, having lived together for such a long time, and seemingly having been devoted to each other in their lifetimes. So Edinburgh's first female doctor was probably a lesbian. We're now standing on Broughton Street. This was where a lot of the city's first LGBTQ organisations were set up in the 1970s and the 1980s, and it's actually still in this area that you'll find most of the city's dedicated LGBTQ venues to this day. In the building behind me, down in the basement, was the first gay organisation set up publicly in the city, and this was the offices in Edinburgh of the Scottish Minorities Group. They were set up in Glasgow in May 1969, and by the 1970s they had set up this centre here in Edinburgh, as well as the Edinburgh Gay Switchboard. Now, this became a public social space for LGBTQ people, representing a visible presence in the city at a time when it would still have been illegal for men to be gay. This was an era of massive social change. Obviously, the Stonewall riots had happened in New York in 1969. Pushes were being made by women, LGBTQ people and people of colour for equality and for true fairness in society. And that's not something that would have passed people in Scotland by. Now, let's head off across the road and we'll go and have a look at where the city's first LGBTQ bookshop would have been. We're now just across the road on 4th Street, which was home to Edinburgh's first LGBTQ bookshop back in the 1980s, Lavender Menace. It would have been just behind the railings in the basement premises that you can see behind me here. Its owners, Sigrid Nielsen and Bob Orr, started out selling LGBTQ literature in the cloakroom of Fire Island, which was a legendary gay club on Edinburgh's Princes Street that no longer exists. Ironically, that premises has since turned into a bookshop. By 1982, just the year after decriminalisation, Bob and Sigrid were able to open their own premises here. Now, even though it was legal, they did sometimes struggle with getting their literature in through customs. It would be seized by the police at times as obscene. But no matter what, they powered through. And this became not just a bookshop, but a social space for LGBTQ people as well. I think that's something that we have to remember now, is back in the 1980s, how much harder it was for LGBTQ folk to find each other. There was no internet, there were no dating apps for gay people or straight people, and being able to walk into a space that was explicitly dedicated to reflecting LGBTQ experiences and allowing people to socialise would have been completely eye-opening for a lot of people in Edinburgh. By 1987, they were able to move to bigger premises, even closer to the city centre, and they changed their name to West and Wild. By the 1990s, the bookshop had shut down, but it's left a legacy that carries on to this day. Just last year, during Pride Month, another local bookshop, Lighthouse Books, hosted a week-long pop-up where Bob and Sigrid were able to resurrect Lavender Menace for an event called Lavender Menace Returns. There's also been a play written about the bookshop by James Leigh called Love Song to Lavender Menace, which was staged at the Edinburgh Festival and at the Royal Lyceum Theatre in the city here. It's not a bad legacy for a little book-selling operation that started out in a club cloakroom in the 1980s. We're now standing up on top of Calton Hill, just a stone's throw away from Broughton Street, where we were down having a look at some of the city's earliest LGBTQ venues. If I take a little turn around so you can have a look at the view. This is one of my favourite views in the city from up here. Now, for at least 100 years, Calton Hill has been a site where gay men could come and meet each other under cover of darkness, largely. For most of that history, it was illegal for them to be gay and to seek out the sexual company of other men. So we know that back in the 1920s, the 1930s, the police conducted raids up here on Calton Hill, and that was something that would have carried on throughout the 20th century as police aggressively tried to crack down on actions that they saw as immoral and which were, at that time, against the law. Now, in the 1980s, a lot of Edinburgh's gay venues and places where people could actually meet each other were hit hard by the AIDS crisis. Edinburgh as a city was particularly hard hit in terms of European countries, considered to be the HIV capital of Europe. Now, one of the things that was driving that epidemic status within Edinburgh was the fact that there were a lot of deprived areas at the time that had a big issue with heroin use in particular, and a lack of availability of clean needles meant that lots of people were unknowingly behaving in a way that was unsafe and putting themselves at risk. Because of this factor, a lot of people in the city became very ill throughout the 1980s. It was a huge, huge crisis that affected the gay community and the wider community in the city as well. Now, thankfully, as time has gone on, huge advances have been made in HIV care, to the point where now when people are tested and treated, it's possible to get their antibodies down to an undetectable level that means it is untransmissible. So nowadays, the story for people who are diagnosed with HIV could not be more different from the picture we were looking at in the 1980s. There's a lot of work being done by charities and social outreach groups to try and reduce the stigma around HIV and to make sure that people have access to the care and the emotional support that they need. Let's carry on and learn a little bit more about the more modern history of how laws have evolved over the years. I'm now sitting here outside the Scottish Parliament, which is where our laws are made. Unfortunately, before we can talk about how things started to get better, we have to talk about how they got worse first. In the 1980s, it was legal to be gay across the whole UK, but there was still a huge amount of discrimination, and the vast majority of people held really bigoted views about LGBTQ folk. Now, none of that stopped groups like the Scottish Minorities Group or the Beaumont Society, which is a trans rights organisation, from making their voices and their identities known. But there was a backlash coming. In 1988, Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government passed an amendment known as Section 28 or Clause 28, which banned teachers from promoting homosexuality or from promoting the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Those are the words of the legislation that I've just quoted at you there. Now, this meant that functionally it was illegal for teachers to talk about LGBTQ issues in any way in school, and that was still the case when I was at school. In 1998, we had our very first sex education lessons, and I remember our teacher, Mrs. Leslie, had put out a box for people to anonymously ask her questions. Somebody had asked, "How do gay people have sex?" Now, Mrs. Leslie was a very no-nonsense woman, and I vividly remember her saying to us, "I would love to be able to talk to you about that, but the law says that I can't." So I'm only 31 years old, and I remember when it was illegal for our teachers to talk to us about LGBTQ people, never mind educate us about the broader issues. By the time I'd started high school in the year 2000, that law had been repealed by the Scottish Parliament in one of its first legislative acts after being re-established in 1999. It would go on to be abolished down in England as well in 2003. Over the next decade, 15 years or so, there was lots of legislation passed that had an effect on LGBTQ people's lives. In 2004, the Gender Recognition Act was passed, which allowed trans people's gender to be legally recognised, although with restrictions and difficulties that people are still fighting against 16 years later. The following year, in 2005, the first civil partnership ceremonies took place for same-sex couples. In 2009, it became possible for gay couples to adopt or foster children, and the following year, the Equality Act was passed by the Westminster government, which consolidated previous anti-discrimination legislation, including protections for LGBTQ folk. By 2014, full marriage equality was achieved. And in a sign of how far society had come in the time since I was told my teacher couldn't even talk to us about gay people, one of the witnesses at the first ceremonies was Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. In 2016, a member of the Scottish Parliament and then leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Kezia Dugdale, described the Scottish Parliament as the gayest parliament in the world. She herself is an out gay woman. At that time, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, was also an out gay woman. And one of the leaders or co-conveners of the Scottish Green Party, Patrick Harvie, was also out in his political career. So we had gone from a situation where it was impossible to even talk about gay people in public life to having gay politicians and bisexual politicians at every level in politics. In 2018, the Scottish Government actually made it a requirement that schools have to teach about LGBTQ history and equality. It is such a huge reversal from when my teacher told us in 1998 it was illegal for her to even have that discussion with us, and now it's a part of our curriculum. I don't want to pretend that Scotland or any other place in the world is perfect and lacking in discrimination or any legal problems when it comes to LGBTQ people's lives. But things have changed and improved massively in a lot of ways in the last 20 years. We all have a responsibility to speak up for LGBTQ people, particularly at this moment in time for trans people as their rights come under attack. Because LGBTQ history is still being written every single day, and we can all play a part in how that story unfolds. Hi everybody! I hope you've been enjoying these virtual tours. If so, I would be eternally grateful if you would consider following the link below and chucking a couple of quid in my virtual tip jar. I am self-employed. 2020 has been a really difficult year to be self-employed in tourism, as I'm sure you can imagine. So we would be so grateful for any support that you're able to give. If not, no worries. The most important thing is that you enjoy these stories and that you're learning about my little country that I'm so excited to share with the world. So share these stories with people you know, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you back here soon. Bye!